Chapter 4. The Imperial Divide. When Constantine crossed into Gaul, he was formally integrated into his father's military command. Over the following months, he shared a series of military successes, earning respect from Constantius's troops and securing their loyalty and favor. Yet the reunion between father and son was short-lived. By mid-306 CE, while in Britain, Constantius fell gravely ill and was forced to retire to the fortress city of Eboracum. Before his death, it was said that he recommended Constantine as a worthy successor to his loyal soldiers. Little persuasion was needed. Upon Constantius's passing, the troops willingly declared his son Augustus in traditional dynastic fashion. Not all welcomed Constantine's newly acclaimed title with enthusiasm. As such a decision ultimately rested in the hands of Galerius, his illegal claim to power further deepened the fractures within the already failing tetrarchy. On hearing the news, Galerius was enraged and threatened to punish the soldiers for their involvement in Constantine's usurpation. His earlier reluctance to release Constantine to join his father's command proved justified. Yet the risks of denouncing his new title posed a significant challenge. The legions, loyal to their newly elected Augustus, would become a substantial threat if they were to revolt amidst an already unstable political climate. Calculating these risks, Galerius chose not to strip Constantine of authority entirely. Instead, he demoted his title to the junior rank of Caesar, while elevating his trusted ally and military officer, Flavius Valerius Severus, to the senior position of Augustus in his place. Back in Rome, the populace were growing dissatisfied with the state of political affairs in the city. Emperors seldom visited the capital anymore due to the administrative shift in Diocletian's configuration of power, and as a result, the atmosphere in Rome was becoming increasingly hostile. Excluded from the arena of politics, the citizens no longer considered Rome the center of imperial power, as authority was no longer exercised from the capital, but from the cities of the Tetrarch's rule, leaving them without an emperor of their own. To further deepen their hostility toward the Tetrarchic system, Rome became burdened with new tax reforms, which replaced previous tax privileges its occupants once enjoyed. The Praetorian Guard, whose role was to protect the emperor, and more than often, dispose and acclaim a new one, lost much of its political leverage. Among those who felt the greatest betrayal was Maxentius, the son of abdicated co-emperor Maximian, who found himself sidelined by the Tetrarchy's settlement. Even more so when news reached Rome of Constantine's promotion to Caesar by Galerius. His disdain of the elected authorities now provoked him to revolt. The populace were willing to embrace any claimant who promised to restore Rome's traditional power, and Maxentius would assert himself as the strongest contender to the imperial seat. Merit-based succession could not be effectively enforced as the Tetrarchy began its gradual slide toward inevitable collapse. So, on October 28, 306 CE, shortly after Constantine's usurpation in the West, Maxentius was illegitimately proclaimed Emperor of Rome. The elevation to this title was supported by a faction of Praetorian Guards and Roman senators, and was further legitimized by the return of his father Maximian, who remained highly respected among the army. With his power now established at Rome, Maxentius's seizure of the imperial post ignited a chain of rivalry that would eventually erupt into a full-scale outbreak of civil war across the empire. The edicts of persecution remained in effect, and religious unrest continued in many urban populations, affecting both the poor and members of the elite. Under the reigns of Constantine and Maxentius, however, the edicts were rarely enforced, effectively preventing the risk of martyrdom and from provoking further divisions within the community. While Maxentius adopted a cautious stance, he still offered no endorsement of Christianity. His tolerance likely served as a political strategy to secure urban support rather than display a genuine sympathy for Christians. Lactantius even accused him of pretending to be a Christian in order to deceive the people. Maxentius sought to restore authority to the Senate, who had long been marginalized under Diocletian's reforms. He believed that legitimacy was rooted in their institution, the city of Rome, and the gods. In doing so, he cast himself as a liberator from Diocletian's imperial invention and fashioned himself as Princeps Augustus, echoing the earlier traditions of Rome's Golden Age. As the new leader, he became a restorer of Roman tradition and religious order, funding extensive work on the restoration of polytheist architecture, particularly the temples of the gods, among other public buildings and sacred sites. He defined imperial greatness with Rome's long-standing traditional framework and adopted the role as protector of the Pax Deorum and restorer of Roman morale. Roman religion formed a central part in his propaganda. Alongside his efforts to restore religious temples, he minted coins struck with images of the gods and demigods, such as Hercules, reinforcing Rome's religious and cultural heritage. Maxentius's rise presented Galerius with yet another challenge, as another imperial son ascended to power without legal sanction. Unlike Constantine, who had been given a lesser title, he did not take Maxentius's accession lightly and instead tasked Severus to descend on Rome with his army and defeat Maxentius to restore order in the capital. The plan might have succeeded if the army that stood behind Severus were not composed of soldiers who had once served under Maximian. Severus was yet to secure the devotion of his newly adopted army, as his promotion was bestowed upon him entirely at the will of Galerius, and not the proclamation of the troops. Upon seeing Maximian and his son when they arrived with Severus to Rome, they abandoned him, refusing to march against their former emperor. So Severus, failing to muster the morale of the army, was forced to flee to Ravenna, where he was soon captured by Maximian's loyal supporters. He was killed or forced to commit suicide, not long after his capture. The failure of Severus demonstrates the enduring weight of dynastic legitimacy, which the imperial sons skillfully exploited against Diocletian's system of merit-based succession. Despite securing Rome's imperial seat, the relationship between father and son quickly deteriorated. After the death of Severus, Maximian's resentment over his secondary role to the imperial title intensified, and he grew increasingly hostile toward his son. Aspiring to assign emperorship to himself, he conspired to dispose of his son. In this act of betrayal, he attempted to persuade the troops to denounce Maxentius, but the plot backfired, as the army's loyalty remained firmly with their new emperor, and they turned against Maximian, publicly humiliating him and driving him from the city. Much to Maxentius's resentment, his father sought an alliance with Constantine, offering his daughter Fausta in marriage in 307 CE to secure a political alliance. This betrayal further deepened the rift between father and son. To delve the wound further, Maximian publicly conferred the title Augustus upon his son-in-law Constantine. However, this served more as a symbolic endorsement rather than a legal promotion, as the title was not sanctioned by Galerius. Yet the weight of the title, being given to him by a former emperor, carried legitimacy to the traditionalist troops. Dependent now on Constantine's protection, Maximian refrained from antagonizing the Christian community under his watch, adopting Constantine's more lenient measures of toleration. It would not be long before Galerius would deal with Maxentius's usurpation himself. Furious upon the death of Severus, he marched to Rome with a substantial force of troops to confront him. In response to the threat, Maxentius fortified Rome's defenses, readying the city for the onset of civil war. However, when Galerius arrived with his soldiers, the morale of the army could not be mustered, resulting in a half-hearted siege that ultimately failed. The memory of Rome's ancient symbolic traditions proved it hard to rally a willing force against the capital and its imperial authority. Loyalty to Maxentius, from the populace to the Praetorian Guard, had formed a formidable obstacle to any rival force to march against the city's center. Frustrated and humiliated, Galerius withdrew, burning parts of the surrounding countryside in his shameful retreat, an act that further tarnished his reputation. Far from these conflicts, at the coastal edge of Salona, the flourishing urban center of the Roman province of Dalmatia, Diocletian enjoyed a peaceful retirement overlooking the Adriatic Sea at his imperial villa. It was effectively a fortified palace retreat, with defensive walls and lengthy grand ceremonial halls, an ambitious display of imperial architecture in which he oversaw every aspect of its design. Now, in his mid-60s and ill of health, he discovered a knack for other hobbies other than his great persecution, a devotion to gardening, a pastime he cherished so much that when Galerius summoned him to return to Rome and settle the escalating disputes, he at first respectfully refused, responding, "If you could see the cabbages I planted with my own hands, you would not be urging me to take up again the cares of the empire." Eventually, he was convinced to part with the imperial cabbages and travel to the military capital of Carnuntum in 308 CE. In attendance of the council was Diocletian, Galerius, Maximian, and Licinius, a trusted military commander who served under Galerius. Understandably, Constantine and Maxentius were absent from the council, or more likely, not invited. The settlement of the council stripped Maximian of any power and forced his second abdication, confirmed Constantine's title as Caesar, denounced Maxentius as an illegal tyrant, and elevated Licinius as Augustus of the West to counter the threat of Maxentius. Diocletian soon retired once more to his cabbages, never to enter the life of politics again. Despite his directives, his orders were soon cast aside. Maximian returned to Constantine's side, while both Constantine and Maxentius continued to push for power. Relations between Constantine and Maximian quickly eroded upon his return, as Maximian also sought to seize power from Constantine as he did to Maxentius in Rome. Whilst Constantine was away on campaign, Maximian declared him dead, looted the imperial treasury, and attempted to win over the soldiers with bribes. Upon learning Maximian's scheming activities, Constantine immediately returned. At first he spared Maximian, who fled to Massilia, but not long after, Maximian was forced to commit suicide in late 310 CE for his deceitful plotting. When news of his father's death reached Rome, Maxentius exploited the events into propaganda against Constantine, seeking to rally dislike against him in the capital. He portrayed Constantine as a tyrant who had callously murdered his own father-in-law and branded him as an unworthy ruler. Casting himself as a moral ruler in comparison, Maxentius strengthened support during the public mourning of his father. Even without tetrarchic endorsement, Maxentius continued to secure his legitimacy in the Roman Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and conservative urban elites, advocating his own reputation as the rightful defender of Roman tradition. Meanwhile, Constantine was cultivating his own image among his troops and across his territories. In 310 CE in Trier, he received a panegyric delivered as part of a coordinated program of political propaganda. The oration described a vision in which Constantine was crowned with laurel leaves bestowed by the goddess Victory, and beheld a vision of Apollo, elevating him to the divine favor of the gods, an honor he accepted without refute. During the years 306 to 310 CE, he frequently minted coins bearing the image of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun closely associated to Apollo, commemorating this public affirmation of authority at Trier. In divine competition with his rival, Maxentius claimed the favor of other gods, such as Jupiter, striking coins with the deity's image accompanied by the inscription Conservator Urbis Suae, protector of the city. Constantine actively participated in polytheistic rituals and Roman festivals, including the celebration of Sol Invictus's birthday on December 25th. As a traditional Roman ruler who adhered to polytheistic practices, he employed religious language that reflected polytheist sensibilities rather than Christian doctrine. However, his coins would later present religious ambiguity in the years to come, which blended Christian and polytheistic symbolism, indicating a transitional stance in his career. This ambiguity could be interpreted as political pragmatism, maintaining appeal to a largely polytheistic empire while gradually incorporating Christianity into his reign. During the year 311 CE, Galerius himself contracted a gruesome illness, interpreted by Christian sources as divine retribution for his role in orchestrating years of relentless persecution. Necrotic wounds consumed his flesh as maggots infested ulcerous lesions which exposed his bone and muscle as he lay festering in his bed. The stench as he decomposed alive was so foul that no one wished to approach him willingly. Along with his illness came a change of policy. Galerius reversed the edict of persecution into one of toleration as a last measure to stabilize the religious unrest and consolidate unity. The edict, issued in Nicomedia of the same year, summarizes the concerns many emperors held over the changes in religious climate across the empire. It highlights the importance of the preservation of religious uniformity and discusses concerns of communities who had abandoned the ancestral rights of their own laws and assemblies. The edict outlines the conditions of Christian religious practice within the empire. Highlighting the importance of religious identity and observance, it reads, "Among other arrangements which we are always accustomed to make for the prosperity and welfare of the Republic, we had desired formerly to bring all things into harmony with the ancient laws and public order of the Romans, and to provide that even the Christians who had left the religion of their fathers should come back to reason, since indeed the Christians themselves, for some reason, had followed such a caprice and had fallen into such a folly that they would not obey the institutes of antiquity, which perchance their own ancestors had first established, but at their own will and pleasure they would thus make laws unto themselves, which they should observe, and would collect various peoples in diverse places in congregations. Finally, when our law had been promulgated to the effect that they should conform to the institutes of antiquity, many were subdued by the fear of danger, many even suffered death. And yet since most of them persevered in their determination, and we saw that they neither paid the reverence and awe due to the gods, nor worshipped the God of the Christians, in view of our most mild clemency and the constant habit by which we are accustomed to grant indulgence to all, we thought that we ought to grant our most prompt indulgence also to these, so that they may again be Christians and may hold their conventicles, provided they do nothing contrary to good order. But we shall tell the magistrates in another letter what they ought to do. Wherefore, for this our indulgence, they ought to pray to their God for our safety, for that of the Republic, and for their own, that the Republic may continue uninjured on every side, and that they may be able to live securely in their homes." The publication of the edict began the gradual shift toward the acceptance of Christian practices without the threat of persecution. Churches that had been confiscated or destroyed were restored or rebuilt, though, as stated in the edict, this freedom was not unconditional. Christians were expected to pray for the health and safety of the emperor and the empire, and in doing so acknowledge the traditional gods who safeguarded Rome. The edict brought an end, at least temporarily, to the persecutions. In the East, however, Maximinus Dio, as Lactantius reports, reluctantly posted the edict in his territories. Yet as soon as Galerius succumbed to disease only weeks later, he resumed his efforts to suppress Christian influence. By late 311 into 312 CE, he sanctioned petitions calling for a renewed ban on Christianity, presenting himself as a defender of the traditional gods against what he regarded as a destabilizing sect. As the Edict of Toleration of 311 CE opened the way for Christianity to rebuild, reorganize, and begin healing the wounds inflicted by years of persecution, the ensuing peace was not without difficulty. The aftermath of the persecution had left a deep division within the Christian community, particularly over the question of how to treat clergy who had lapsed, those who, under imperial pressure, had surrendered scriptures or performed sacrifices to the gods. In North Africa, this divide split the church into two opposing factions. Following the death of Bishop Mensurius of Carthage in 311, his successor Caecilian was consecrated by Felix of Aptunga, a bishop accused by some as being a traditor who had handed over sacred scriptures to Roman authorities. This act was deemed to invalidate Caecilian's ordination. His leniency toward lapsed Christians during the persecutions further encouraged criticism. A council of Numidian bishops rejected Caecilian's appointment and instead consecrated a rival bishop, Majorinus. This act established a schism within the church of two competing episcopal authorities, one led by Caecilian in Carthage, who would later be supported by Constantine, the other led by Majorinus, rooted in the rigorist rural communities of Numidia. The latter faction that demanded absolute purity among the clergy would become known as the Donatists, a movement that endured for generations as a challenge to the unity of the African Church and imperial religious policy. Although Galerius's Edict of Toleration had formally brought the persecution to an end, lasting rifts remained within the Christian community, particularly in its attitudes toward polytheists. As the Church sought to prepare for a more public existence, it remained vulnerable to political manipulation and internal division. In the East, peace was far from secure under the persistent hostility of Maximinus Dio. The great church of Nicomedia, that once stood impressively across from the imperial palace, was never rebuilt as Christianity could not yet fully emerge into public life within the capital, which Maximinus exercised his authority. Churches across the empire were again faced with the task of rebuilding themselves region by region. With many bishops and presbyters executed, exiled, or driven into hiding, the ecclesiastical hierarchy needed to be re-established almost from the ground up. Vacancies across the church had to be refilled swiftly, and bishops and presbyters worked quickly to restore order and re-establish the diaconal network. Deacons, entrusted with managing the church's wealth and charitable networks, continued to rebuild funds through donations from wealthy Christians, enabling the renewal of community support. These efforts reinforced local cohesion and strengthened the church's authority in a time of fragility and transition, setting up a network for the beneficial integration of imperial and ecclesiastical structures, which would later serve to strengthen Constantine's rule. The major split of the North African Church over the treatment of the Lapsi threatened the unity of Christianity across the empire. In Rome, the church remained comparatively intact and stable under the rule of Maxentius. Although disputes still arose, violent sedations over the Lapsi were quickly suppressed. Maxentius exiled the Roman bishops Marcellus and Eusebius for their rigorist stance on matters of clerical purity, which resulted in significant unrest within the capital. Despite these disputes, no formal schism divided the Roman community as a result of his intervention in church affairs. Constantine would soon turn to the church, leveraging its expanding ecclesiastical hierarchy as a relatively stable institution. The church's capacity to reorganize and sustain itself offered a pragmatic solution to stabilize power where the tetrarchy had failed, providing cohesion and functionality in a fractured empire. Yet before Constantine could rely on this institutional stability, the empire would be engulfed in civil war, driven by the rivalries of the imperial sons and the conflicting ambitions of the remaining tetrarchs.